I am convinced we are only days away from a ceasefire. Those were the words that lit up the global stage. Words uttered by a man who, only moments prior, had been pressed by reporters digging for any scrap of hope in the midst of an unfolding tragedy. Diplomatic corridors have been buzzing. International observers have been on high alert, and those caught in the crossfire have clung to any sign that the conflict battering their daily lives might at last simmer down. How could anyone look at the wreckage, the tension, and the seemingly endless barrage of accusations and still stand there speaking of peace like it was just around the corner? That is precisely the question on everyone's mind. Today we will unravel how this glimmer of optimism emerged, who exactly is behind these wavering lines of truce, and why this moment, perhaps more than any before it, feels like either a tipping point toward reconciliation or one last false start in a region too accustomed to broken promises. But hold on. Is this conflict just one headline among many chaotic episodes across the globe? Or is there something unique here that might transform how nations negotiate, how leaders stake their reputations, and how everyday citizens cope with the specter of unending violence? The tension on the ground has soared to such extremes that some diplomatic veterans have dared to call it a final reckoning. Others see it as yet another chapter in a heartbreakingly familiar script. In this episode, we will dissect these dramatic developments, sift through the statements by key players, and shine a light on the deeper motivations that may hold the key to lasting peace, or open a new, more ominous gateway to chaos. In the next few minutes, we will uncover the secret channels of communication that have emerged between high-level negotiators, the reasons behind the blockade that turned into a humanitarian flashpoint, and why the term genocide has suddenly reared its head in official complaints. We will examine the impetus behind well-placed optimism, a renewed push from powerful negotiators who have recently brokered an agreement in a separate flashpoint involving Iran and Israel, as well as a swirl of rumors about how these backroom talks could impact the very foundations of the Middle East. By the end of this deep dive, you will have a clearer map of the hidden motivations, the suspected double agendas, and the fragile hope that sees each day potentially tilting toward a new dawn or a deeper night of tragedy. Let us begin. He stood in the Oval Office, flanked by somber-faced advisors, referencing phone calls he had just concluded with individuals close to the crisis. The man in question is Donald Trump, the President of the United States, who declared that peace could come within the next week to the embattled Gaza Strip. To appreciate the weight of such a statement, one has to understand the charred rubble left behind by what has been described as an unending cycle of rocket fire, reprisal attacks, and, more recently, extraordinary claims of attempted negotiations for a permanent cessation of hostilities. When Trump casually said, "I think it's close," he might as well have dropped a thunderbolt across the news networks. It was a stark pivot from the bleakness that had plagued international commentary just days prior, where the prospects of a truce between Israel and Hamas seemed buried under miles of mistrust. Yet, here we are, with renewed diplomatic momentum that appears to have grown out of a separate deal overshadowed by American-brokered tension between Israel and Iran. Yes, you heard that correctly. Israel and Iran, two nations that, by most conventional wisdom, show no inclination toward friendly dialogue, were roped into a U.S.-backed ceasefire after 12 days of intense confrontation. The region watched with bated breath as American warplanes targeted Iranian nuclear sites, an escalation that horrified the global community. Surprisingly, those battered negotiations ended in a fragile agreement, one that might have created an unplanned blueprint for how to cool down other volatile areas, such as Gaza. To understand the complete picture, we need to rewind and see how the initial spark of conflict in Gaza either overshadowed or was overshadowed by events involving Iran. It all began after Hamas, the Iran-backed militant organization controlling Gaza, launched a sudden onslaught on Israel on October 7, 2023, resulting in the tragic loss of 1,200 Israeli lives. The world was left reeling. Even more shocking was the fact that 251 hostages were taken, plunging families into unimaginable grief and intensifying Israel's resolve for retribution. Israel, in a swift and devastating response, initiated an operation in Gaza that the local health ministry claims has led to more than 56,000 Palestinian deaths. For many, these numbers are too large to even process. We are talking about entire neighborhoods laid to waste, a population on the brink of starvation due to blocked aid channels, and a region that physically appears as though it has been through decades rather than weeks of bombardment. How, then, did we arrive at a moment where some semblance of peace might be possible? It was not a simple question of, "We are sorry, let's shake hands." Instead, behind-the-scenes negotiations ramped up, particularly as the American administration grew worried that the conflict could spiral beyond control, spread to neighboring countries, or drag global superpowers into direct confrontation. The scene was set for an urgent push, shift resources, diplomatic capital, and alliances to muzzle what many feared would become an uncontrollable blaze. Trump's near-daily conversations with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu apparently yielded an environment in which a small, flickering candle of hope could be lit in an otherwise dark corridor. But let us not shy away from the blunt truth. For an agreement to hold, Hamas must be on board, and Hamas is not a monolithic entity. Any final arrangement would require the faction that orchestrated that devastating October raid to relinquish its capacity for renewed attacks, or at least place them under strict limitation. Meanwhile, Israel, increasingly resolute in its demands, insists that the only path to a final peace is the complete disarmament and dismantlement of Hamas. That is a step that the group, emboldened by regional influence from certain corners, has no desire to undertake unless there are major concessions from the Israeli side. This is where we encounter one of the gravest obstacles to forging a sustainable agreement: the blockade. After the previous truce collapsed at the tail end of former President Joe Biden's administration, Israel enacted a blockade that choked off essential supplies to Gaza. The resulting humanitarian crisis quickly accelerated, with international aid organizations sounding alarms about shortages of food, water, and medical necessities. Scarcity in the region soared to unbearable levels, prompting accusations of war crimes when it became apparent that innocent civilians, including children, were bearing the brunt of political gamesmanship. Israeli officials, for their part, consistently denied these allegations and maintained that the blockade was a necessary step to cripple Hamas's capabilities. Enmeshed in this tragic tapestry is the looming specter of political maneuvering around Iran. The conflagration between Israel and Iran that erupted concurrently with the conflict in Gaza injected an entirely new dimension into the region's complexities. American warplanes and Israeli intel guided a swift, punishing campaign against Iranian nuclear installations, culminating in a short yet ferocious period of violence lasting 12 days. Remarkably, an agreement was struck, temporarily halting hostilities in that sphere. Though the details remain largely under wraps, the fact that Tehran even considered a halt to its nuclear program, if only for a short window, has raised eyebrows and begs a question. If Israel and Iran, bitter rivals for decades, can settle on even a momentary suspension of aggression, can that template serve as an inspiration for a more lasting peace between Israel and Hamas? So far, the signs are mixed. Trump's public statements exude optimism. He points to the telephone calls he personally conducted, the U.S. envoys crisscrossing the region, and the top-level Israeli and American officials who are apparently determined to end this cycle. On the flip side, longtime watchers of the region caution that we have seen glimmers of potential peace before, only for them to crash against the hard rocks of entrenched ideological grievances and the vested interests of key power brokers. Indeed, as we shall see, this entire puzzle extends beyond the chessboard of immediate violence into a grander, more global game. Countries far from the Middle East border have a stake in ensuring that oil prices remain stable, that radical ideologies do not spill over into their own territories, and that the possibility of nuclear confrontation remains firmly in the realm of fiction. In the midst of these uncertainties, one thing is abundantly clear. The region's civilians are suffering on a scale that stuns the senses. Entire families have been displaced from their homes, scraping by on whatever meager rations they can find. Hospitals overloaded with the wounded struggle under scrutiny from international aid agencies, while reports of potential famine loom large, especially as the blockade persists. Local health officials, speaking under conditions of anonymity, describe scenes of heartbreak and devastation seldom witnessed. The question, above all else, is, will saving ordinary people become the paramount concern, or will it be overshadowed once again by the lethal interplay of political maneuvering? Here, we come to our first emotional juncture in this story. After hearing about these gut-wrenching realities, do you believe it is time for more people around the world to become informed and engaged? If you find that this vivid picture of struggle resonates with you, then tap that like button or share your support in any small way you can so that more individuals can see the full scope of what is unfolding. Now, let us delve deeper into the intricacies. Although Israeli officials have historically approached Hamas with suspicion and have undertaken severe military measures to weaken it, there is a complicated spectrum of opinions within Israel about how to resolve the crisis permanently. Prime Minister Netanyahu, certain to figure prominently in any future deal, is slated to discuss these matters in Washington with Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister for Strategic Affairs. These upcoming meetings, as hinted by the administration itself, could be the stage for an ambitious plan that not only cements a halt in Gaza, but also clarifies how to manage the nuclear question with Iran. It is a double-layered approach that attempts to address two major security dilemmas simultaneously. A cynic might argue that these negotiations could unravel under the weight of unaligned interests, but the fact that both sides continue to engage says something about the pressure they face to find a resolution. At the center of this labyrinth is the position of Hamas regarding the hostages, the battered civilian population, and the future of the Gaza Strip. Many insiders whisper that Hamas, while refusing to disarm, recognizes that their governance in Gaza has become nearly impossible due to the destruction of vital infrastructure. Talks about releasing the remaining hostages in exchange for an end to the relentless airstrikes have slowly evolved, although skeptics doubt that Hamas would be willing to simply give up a critical bargaining chip without a major concession from Israel. The group's leadership has alternated between defiantly swearing to continue resistance and offering ambiguous signals of willingness to negotiate. Then there is the dynamic of the broader Arabian region. Some neighboring states, historically wary of either Israel's or Iran's ambitions, appear more open than ever to supporting a path to peace, if only to stave off further chaos. In certain circles, it has been suggested that a new Middle Eastern diplomatic framework might emerge, one that could reshape alliances in astonishing ways. Even countries that once had no formal relations with Israel might be coaxed to the table if they believe there is a real chance to contain Iran's nuclear aspirations and bring stability to areas that have too long been plagued by war. Whether this is idealistic speculation or a real possibility depends on one's viewpoint, but, as we have learned repeatedly, the Middle East can surprise us all. One cannot overlook the looming specter of allegations of war crimes. When so many civilian lives are lost, international observers step in, and courts or tribunals may attempt to hold individuals accountable. Israel has categorically dismissed accusations of conducting a genocide, stating that its operations are defensive measures aimed at crippling terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations argue that the blockade, the volume of civilian casualties, and the scale of destruction in Gaza cross the threshold of what is permissible under international law. The question is whether these accusations will be thoroughly investigated, or if political expediency will overshadow any pursuit of justice once the guns go silent. With so many overlapping challenges, how can anyone maintain a semblance of hope? Trump, echoing the sentiments of his advisors, claims that the recent success of securing a ceasefire in the separate Israel-Iran confrontation provides a vital blueprint. If even those two staunch adversaries could momentarily halt aggressive actions, perhaps that diplomatic momentum might extend into the triangular dynamic with Hamas. Critics, however, warn that drawing parallels between dealing with a state actor like Iran and controlling the actions of a non-state militant group in Gaza is misguided. They argue that Hamas, shaped by decades of distrust, is less susceptible to standardized negotiations than a nation that has deep institutional frameworks and economic considerations. Now, let us try to see how this might play out in the coming days. Judging by the buzz in diplomatic circles, various proposals are circling: a partial lifting of the blockade to allow critical aid into Gaza, a temporary ceasefire, which could evolve into a longer-term truce if conditions are met, the release of hostages in waves, each stage accompanied by further relaxation of the blockade, and an international oversight body to monitor compliance on all sides. The latter is particularly intriguing, as it suggests that outside observers might be tasked with making sure that neither Hamas nor Israel resumes the cycle of violence. However, such arrangements are only workable if both sides agree to let external forces see what is actually happening on the ground. Moreover, Israel's leadership has not been shy about stating that they want to see Hamas permanently stripped of its capacity to wage war, and that any final settlement must tie the group's future to a formal acceptance of Israel's right to exist. Hamas, on the other hand, has historically refused to acknowledge that right and sees itself as the vanguard of Palestinian resistance. Might a battered Hamas reconsider its stance under the weight of thousands of deaths and near-total devastation in Gaza, or do they believe that an unbreakable spirit of resistance still gives them viable leverage? Only time will tell. But, as watchers of Middle Eastern affairs might say, this predicament underscores why the region has faced so many heartbreakingly short-lived truces. Some voices within the international community suggest that a stronger humanitarian framework must be put in place to guard against cycles of reprisal. This might entail setting up humanitarian corridors, reconnaissance teams to verify compliance with any armistice, and binding commitments not to target crucial facilities like hospitals, schools, and water treatment plants. After all, the repeated destruction of critical infrastructure dooms families to a lifetime of indignity, fueling the next generation's anger and sense of disenfranchisement. Will the emerging opportunities for peace incorporate such protective measures, or will these ideas once again be lost in the scramble of bigger geopolitical concerns? Times of conflict often bring out the most surprising alliances and the most startling betrayals. Some speculate that unnamed parties may pressure Israel behind closed doors to show restraint, hoping to avoid an uncontrollable explosion of regional unrest. At the same time, Hamas is thought to have supporters who may encourage them to keep pushing the envelope, believing that a battered Israel might eventually relent on key political issues. These behind-the-scenes pressures can be more decisive than public announcements, which is why the statements from leaders often reveal only a fraction of what is actually happening. The outcome of this interplay could either nudge both belligerents towards some measure of compromise, or push them even further apart. By now, you might be wondering what each party truly stands to gain if a ceasefire does materialize. For Trump, securing harmony in that part of the Middle East would significantly boost his legacy. For Netanyahu, containing a dangerous conflict and deflecting allegations of human rights abuses could restore part of his battered reputation. Hamas could claim a symbolic victory if it extracts concessions and demonstrates that its militant posture forced serious attention to the plight in Gaza. And for the region's people, even a short respite from violence can mean the difference between life and death. If this resonates with you in any way, you might want to subscribe and stay connected so we can keep following all the twists and turns this story will deliver. As we wind deeper into these complexities, remember that so many attempts at peace in the Middle East have been undone by last-second sabotage, an unexpected rocket attack, an intercepted shipment of arms, or a political miscalculation that triggers a renewed round of violence. Even with the White House's dramatic statements about a possible ceasefire within the next week, it is critical to temper optimism with an understanding of how tenuous negotiations can be. The greater the hopes, the more devastating the impact if those hopes are dashed. Indeed, years of conflict have taught us that no handshake or photo opportunity can substitute for structural agreements that address the core grievances fostering continuous opposition. Let us also not forget the intangible factors, like public perception. With modern media, any act of aggression by either side will be scrutinized in real time around the globe, ratcheting up or toning down international pressure. The Jewish community worldwide watches closely, as do Palestinian diaspora communities in multiple continents. Governments that used to speak quietly about the conflict can no longer afford to remain neutral or silent when images of bombed-out neighborhoods and wounded children dominate news cycles. These emotions steer leaders just as powerfully as economic or geopolitical considerations. And that is why, sometimes, the public's outrage can break a stalemate that seemed immovable. At this point, officials involved in these delicate negotiations want to seize upon what momentum exists, leveraging the framework established by the recent Israel-Iran ceasefire. This angle provides a ready-made example of how seemingly implacable enemies can step back from the brink, at least for a while. However, the complexities in Gaza, such as the blockade, the collapsed infrastructure, the presence of hostages, and the primal fear infused in daily life, might prove even trickier to navigate. Any real progress requires addressing the fundamental conundrum. How does one deal with an entity, Hamas, considered a terrorist group by Israel and several Western nations, which also stands as the de facto authority to be negotiated with inside Gaza? Meanwhile, consider the possibility that tangible breakthroughs might just be overshadowed by new geopolitical tornadoes. Could we see a scenario where Iranian hardliners, angered by the temporary ceasefire with Israel, decide to escalate in another arena to sabotage any semblance of calm? Might the internal political tensions in the United States, with various factions holding different views about the Middle East, create friction that hampers the White House's ability to pursue a consistent strategy? These questions hang like storm clouds on the horizon, reminding us that even the most well-intended deals can unravel rapidly in such a volatile theater. If a lasting ceasefire is reached, or, dare we say, something even more ambitious like a permanent agreement, it would signal an extraordinary shift in dynamics that have defined the region for decades. It might pave the way toward renewed Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, a process that has stagnated for far too long. Perhaps new diplomatic avenues, once unthinkable, will open with neighbors who used to observe from a distance. Maybe the blockade that contributed so acutely to humanitarian suffering will be eased under international oversight, ensuring that dire needs are finally met while signals of conflict are minimized. Additionally, it could radically alter the landscape in which extremist ideologies recruit, as local populations see alternatives to perpetual warfare. At the core of all this stands the question: will we remember these days as the moment when the momentum of tragedy turned into a movement for lasting peace, or will historians simply catalog them as yet another ephemeral pause before the lethal cycle resumed? Much will depend on the leadership displayed by those in power, the readiness of the international community to commit resources for rebuilding, and the moral courage of both sides to recognize that unbridled violence leads nowhere but further devastation. Although cynics might see no reason to hope, it is precisely within the worst storms that we often discover unwavering resolve, a willingness to try one more time for the sake of countless civilians on all sides. Still, we stand at a crossroads. Will the negotiations truly culminate in a binding agreement within the coming days, as Trump suggested? Or will the short fuse burn out, overshadowed by the historically hardened positions that many from both camps refuse to abandon? Could a shift in the public mood, especially with repeated images of suffering, pressure leaders to compromise, or will the cycle of blame prove too entrenched? Time is short, and the stakes could hardly be higher. With each passing hour, the risk that an incident on the ground ignites renewed hostility looms like an ever-present storm cloud. That is precisely why events in the next few days may prove more decisive, more critical than any diplomatic overtures of the recent past. Remember that these developments are not happening in a vacuum. Other powers may intervene with their own interests, be they financial, strategic, or ideological. That interplay could accelerate a truce or crush it before it even takes real shape. All eyes, then, remain on Washington, where key leaders may hold the final puzzle pieces needed to knit together a workable framework for calm. If the new round of high-level talks leads to an actionable plan, we could see an end to the blockade, a release of hostages, and, at least momentarily, a lull in a conflict that has racked the region with sorrow for too many years. Whether you are new to following the Middle East or have been tracking developments for decades, the unfolding scenario has grown more riveting by the day. There is a particular gravity in the notion that one handshake, one phone call, or one signature can alter the lives of countless families, shaping the relationships within and beyond the region for generations. And so, as the world waits to see if promise becomes reality, the underlying question remains how a region with thousands of shattered dreams might begin to rebuild trust from the ruins. Let us watch, question, and remain hopeful, for even the smallest step toward peace can illuminate a path that once seemed impossibly dark.